Hello and welcome to Solomoriah Speaks, episode 13, Some Questions. Today I'm going to answer some questions that have been posted to me on Facebook. I'm not going to be able to get to everything that was asked, but I'm going to answer a few things, just a representative sample, I guess, of the questions. People ask me a lot about different ways of judging things, different ways of resolving things. John Lopez asks me to talk about the ability check rule in basic fantasy versus the 1 in X, 1 in 1d6 rule that I often use. I addressed that mechanic a little more in a blog post entitled Meta Rules, which I will try to remember to link in the description for this video. But basically it refers to the mechanic used for things like searching for secret doors, forcing doors open, and so forth, where a player character rolls a d6 and succeeds on a 1 or a 1 or 2 or whatever. Sometimes, particularly for like the opening doors mechanic, it's a 1 on 1d6 where the strength bonus is added to the range. So a character with 17 strength has a +2 bonus, would have a range of 1 to 3 on 1d6 to open a door. The search for secret doors mechanic, which is typically 1 on 1d6, but it's 1 to 2 for an elf if the elf, is searching for secret doors. Things like that, mechanics like that. Those kind of rolls can be used for a lot of things, especially if you use the ability modifier applied to it. It becomes a kind of an ability roll. But we have a mechanic for ability rolls in basic fantasy, back in the Game Master section, where the ability rolls are made on a d20 and the roll target number gets easier as the character gains levels. So why would you choose one or the other? The D6 ability roll rule, the rule used to open doors, is appropriate anytime you have a task which is difficult, becomes substantially easier if you have good ability scores, or have a good ability score that's appropriate to the task, and really shouldn't be affected by levels. Level 20 character is not going to be that much better at forcing a door open than a level 1 character. The strength is the most important thing. Strength and overall mass of the character. This is why half ogres get a bonus to forcing doors, because not only are they strong, they're big. And the game doesn't give any general rules for using those D6 rolls, or those 1 in X rolls, or whatever you want to call them. The single die, low number, target, non-level adjusted roll. The game doesn't give any guidance for that, because there aren't a lot of situations actually addressed directly in the game rules that would need it, and those that are already have it. And it's left to the game master to decide. If you're presented with a situation where that mechanic seems appropriate, you're the game master. Do it that way. That's fine. And related to that, I don't have this down here on my list, but John Lopez and Will Sanders are both players in my online game. Will mentioned in a recent post on Facebook an arm wrestling match that his character was involved in with an NPC. I could have had them both make rolls, or I could have figured a target number out based on the NPC's ability and then just had Will roll for it to see if he won or lost. But anyone who's watched a real arm wrestling match knows that when two opponents are fairly closely matched to each other, that the arm wrestling will go on for a little bit. Probably not as long as it did in the game. I made it up as I went along, as I say. What I had them do, I had each character roll a d6 and add ability bonus. So I didn't do that as a 1 in whatever roll. It was a d6 plus the ability bonus. Then I rolled a d6 secretly. And the number result from the d6 roll is how much the higher roller needed to beat the lower roller to win outright. So if I rolled high, they were likely to stay stalemated unless there was just a really good roll on one part and a really bad roll on the other. If I rolled low, It just took a little bit of an edge for one character to get ahead of the other. And I described it that way. If Will had a better result than the NPC, Joza was the name of the NPC character. If Will had a better roll, but it wasn't as much better as my D6 roll, then I would describe that he started to get the better of him, and he started to push him down, but he hadn't quite got him there yet. And then it would go the other way in the next round and so forth. And as I say, probably a real match doesn't have quite that many reversals as we ended up having, because I let the dice dictate. But it was fun. It was always the most important part. It's always the most important rule when we're doing this kind of thing. If the mechanic you choose as a game master lends to the fun of the game, then it might not be right, but it's not wrong, if you get my drift. I use the 1 in X, as John describes it, but the low number, single die, ability adjusted roll, fairly frequently in my games. Others might not. If I think an ability check should be easier for a higher level character, if it's something that your ability applies to it, but also knowing, just having general adventuring experience is a good advantage, then I'll use the mechanic given in the rules, the mechanic I created there for ability rolls. And why don't I use the 1d20 low number? Okay, I'm back. Why don't I use the low number D20 roll equal to or less than your ability score roll? That's a pretty common old school rule. Occasionally people would use 3d6s to roll under instead of a D20, which is completely different. But the mechanical difference remains much the same from my perspective. If you use a D20 roll under the ability score, you're going to have characters whose ability scores typically range from 9 to 16, 17, maybe 18. So the range of success rates for ability rolls made that way, in my opinion, is too narrow. It's not enough. The difference between 9 and 15 is 30%. It's every point, every number on a D20 is 5%. So 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 6, 30% difference. I tried a mechanic like that, very much the same mechanic in an earlier game where we had one character whose strength was like 16 or 17, and another character whose strength was 10, and the character with the 10 strength was always forcing doors easier than the one with the 16 just because of bad die rolls. But the problem there wasn't just the bad die rolls, it was that the gap wasn't wide enough. We were using that mechanic to open doors, and it was just not hard enough for the lower stat character. And yeah, I could have applied adjustments or modifiers or whatever, but it was just easier to use a die roll that has that numbering mechanic baked in. Using 3d6s instead of a d20 on an ability roll, it, in a way, is even worse because of the stiff bell curve distribution of 3d6 roll, where most of your results are going to be in the middle range. A character with a 9 is going to fail quite a bit because he's just below the edge of the peak of the curve. But a character who's got a 12 is just above the peak of the curve is going to win those rolls all the time. I mean, not all the time, but it's going to be really, really easy to win those rolls. They're going to win most of the time. So using 3d6s for that mechanic is even worse than using a d20. It flips in the other direction and goes from everything being too closely spaced to things being way too widely spaced on likelihood. Character with an 18 strength forcing doors is just literally going to walk through every door he comes to, even if you require him to roll lower rather than equal to or lower, which would be the appropriate way to handle a 3d6 roll on ability scores. But even a character with a 13 or 14 is just going to knock one door after another down, just blaze through them using 3d6s. And that's part of the design goal of Basic Fantasy, was to incorporate mechanics where if the game master was presented with a situation that the game mechanics did not directly address, there would be pieces in the toolbox of the game that the game master could pull out and say, I'll try this. This works in this similar situation. I'll apply it here. I tried not to use mechanics, especially like 3d6 under, which is a really, like I said, a really bad mechanic in my opinion. I tried to avoid using mechanics that were going to blow up in the game master's face if he or she applied them inappropriately. So that's a lot more than just the answer to John Lopez's question. I'm going to hit a couple more before I sign off for this one. James Simpson asked about rewarding experience points for unusual situations like monster negotiation. If you can negotiate your way out of a fight, you should get experience for it. But he wasn't as dangerous. Follow me on this. If you fight a monster, if you choose to fight a monster and you win, it was dangerous. Your monster could have hurt your characters, could have killed your characters, may have killed some of your characters, and so obviously full experience points applied. The risk of actually fighting the monster is death. The risk of failing a negotiation is fighting the monster. So it's not the same as the risk of death. The risk of death goes to fighting the monster. That's a step further. So if you negotiate and win, I don't feel like you should get full experience for the monster, but I do feel like you should get some experience. As a game master, I would almost certainly give half experience for negotiating your way out of a fight with a monster. That's negotiated. If you turn the undead and drive away an entire group of undead monsters, I think the same thing applies. Unless you were already fighting characters that had already been harmed at the point that the turning was applied, I would not apply full experience for the monsters turned away. I'd probably apply about half. The game doesn't prescribe, Basic Fantasy does not prescribe how you do this, nor does Iron Falcon prescribe how you award experience for those situations. It is left to the game master. If you disagree with me and you want to do it another way, it's your game. If you're happy and your players are happy, it's not my place to tell you you're doing it wrong. But that's how I would do it. Okay, this guy's asking about doing a walkthrough video. We're going to skip over that. Martin Serena asked a number of questions. I'm going to just address briefly his first one. He asks about balancing encounter and adventure difficulty. I'm sorry. I'd love to give you a firm rule for this, but it's an art. It really is. I've had to deal, when I started writing Basic Fantasy and started writing the first adventures, I was still remembering my previous campaign group from a different game, where I had one player who had an almost supernatural ability to roll good numbers. Fantastic die rolling. Pretty sure he wasn't cheating. Did it with other people's dice, even did it with mine, and everyone claimed my dice were cursed. But he could, if it involved making a roll to do it, he was going to probably succeed at it. And my skills at balancing encounters and adventures, unfortunately, had been skewed by the fact that any party that this particular player was a group of was probably going to blaze through the monsters fairly easily. So, I'm sorry, the Old Island Fortress in the Morgan's Fort book is probably tougher than it ought to be. And I'm sorry about that. When I actually wrote parts of that adventure before the Basic Fantasy was even done. It was introductory, was written along with the game. Excuse me. And I was thinking about that. I wasn't thinking about it. I was more influenced by that experience. Over the last several years, I've dealt with more normal player groups who don't have any characters with any players with any supernatural abilities. Lots of characters with supernatural abilities, but players with any players that have any special abilities to manipulate dice results. And I think my skills have gotten better. If you, as a beginning game master, are trying to balance encounters, and you don't have that feel yet for your group, for the overall process of doing it, you don't really understand how to do it. There's two simple rules of thumb that are baked into the game. Number one is, generally speaking, an equal number of monsters whose hit dice agree with the average level of the party is probably a fair fight. Remember that player characters can't survive too many fair fights in one day because each fight is going to leave them worn down. But that's a fair fight. Use that as a basis to figure from. The second thing is, monsters that have an asterisk after their name in the core rules are considered especially difficult. This usually means that they're resistant to some kinds of weapons. Require silver weapons, require silver or magical weapons to hit them. Sometimes it refers to monsters that have outsized powers, abilities that are going to be difficult for the player characters to deal with, like Ghoul's ability to paralyze on touch. So these are factors that you should take into account. These two things. Is the monster's hit dice more or less matched to the party? If you have a smaller number of monsters, you can get away with larger hit dice, but you do need to take care with that. It's not always fair either way. Sometimes a single monster with a lot higher hit dice isn't the challenge that you'd expect it to be, because its other stats may not be that much superior. It's often surprising how easily a dragon can be defeated by player characters if you, as the game master, don't play the dragon well. Sometimes it swings the other way. Sometimes a monster that's already hard to hit, difficult to damage, if you pile hit dice on it, if it's got a lot of hit dice, either as it is in the book or because you've modified it for your adventure, it may be a lot tougher than you think it's going to be. And I get it wrong occasionally. Don't be surprised if you do as a game master. All I can say is just, be careful. Use your best judgment and be careful with it. And keep those rules of thumb in mind. Let's see if I can get one more in here. Encounters with NPCs, reaction rolls, and the end result. Okay. I have strong feelings about this. A lot of game masters just don't use reaction rolls at all. They don't use the reaction dice at all. I think this is a mistake, because as a game master, you are aware of what your players are trying to accomplish. You are aware of whatever dirty tricks they're trying to play on the NPCs or whatever is going on. And it's difficult not to let what's in your head color how you make the NPC's decisions for them. I'm not saying you don't have the privilege of doing that. As a game master, that's your job. The NPCs are yours to play. But if you make the decisions, every decision for every NPC, do they believe the players, do they not believe the players, whatever, you make all those decisions yourself, you'll become predictable. You just will. There's no avoiding it. Basic Fantasy provides a good mechanism for reaction rolls. Iron Falcon provides a better one, because Iron Falcon's reaction roll mechanic is applied to morale for monsters as well. Basic Fantasy has a different morale rule, and loyalty checks work a little differently in Basic Fantasy. I'm actually using the Iron Falcon mechanisms for all my games, regardless of which system I'm using. I do use Basic Fantasy morale occasionally with monsters, but much more frequently these days I'm using the system I present in Iron Falcon. I think it's better. I wasn't fully experienced with the Iron Falcon method. I hadn't even written it yet when I wrote Basic Fantasy. Basic Fantasy was intended to mimic specific rules, but I think if I was to write Basic Fantasy from scratch, I'd probably use Iron Falcon's morale and loyalty and reaction mechanics. The important part here is, regardless of which system I like, and regardless of which system you like, if you let the dice make the decisions, at least part of the time, about what your NPCs will or won't do, what they believe or don't believe, who they like and dislike, if you let the dice make these decisions, you'll remove your bias from it. Portray what the dice tell you to portray. If a charismatic player character approaches a NPC and tries to get a good deal on buying a sword, and you roll a really bad reaction roll, it doesn't matter how good that guy's charisma is, the NPC doesn't like him. Her, whoever. Let the NPC reflect that. The NPC can either A, act hostile, difficult, whatever, or B, be friendly as heck but run the price up to double. Oh, sir, I'm so happy to help you with that. It's going to be X times 2 number of gold pieces for this sword. Just as happy as a clam, but they just don't like the player character, and then someone else comes in they like, and they react exactly the same way and give them half price, or, well, probably not half price, but give them a good price for it as opposed to a gouging price. This works in interesting ways sometimes. In a recent scenario where my player characters were in a certain keep on a certain borderland, and they were attempting to convince NPCs of various things, one particular player whose charisma was average kept getting bad reaction rolls. He came to the conclusion that the entire town was out to get him, which was really kind of funny, actually, especially when other player characters went up to the same NPCs, got decent reaction rolls, and got exactly what the first player character was unable to get. He was saying, let's just get out of this place. No one likes us here. Well, no, it was just him, but that's how it goes. Not an unlikable guy, just how the dice played that day, but it made for an interesting scenario. Use the dice to prevent yourself from becoming too predictable. Use the dice for morale rolls. Use the dice for reaction checks. Use the dice to choose random encounters. Don't just pick them all the time. If you roll something you don't want to do, roll again. Keep it random if you can. If you must pick. But if you pick the random encounters all the time, you'll become predictable. It's just how it works, because you can't help your bias. Very few of us can really overcome our own biases. No one is ever as random as they think they are. But if you use dice to resolve at least some of these situations, you will be able to be random, which makes you less predictable. Yeah, and I think that I have a lot more on here. Some of these are... Oh, I'm going to answer one more. Gabe Fua asks, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, Gabe. How do you prep for a campaign and sessions? Prep? What's that? No. It depends on your skill level, and it depends on your comfort zone. This is as personal a question as any game mastering question can be. You do what works for you. How do I do it? I can tell you how I do it, but I don't want you to think that I'm a model or example. Much of the time, in my current games these days, I am actually running adventures that someone has already written. Either my own adventures that I have written and published or so forth for the Basic Fantasy Project or the Iron Falcon game, or adventures other people have submitted to those games, or very rarely either a vintage adventure or adventures from other games that I've adapted. I run other people's games a lot. If they're basic fantasy modules, we make a point to create modules, adventures that contain enough information at the front of the module for the game master to understand what's going on, so that he or she doesn't have to read the whole module in advance to be able to run it competently. That's the plan. It doesn't always work that way, but that's the plan. That's the intention, to have the what's going on here section at the beginning of each adventure tell the game master enough so that he or she can make reasonable decisions quickly while looking at only one room description at a time. And of course, the adventures I wrote myself, although my memory's not as good as I'd like to think it is, I usually can remember the overall ideas and follow along pretty well with my own adventures. So prep for those adventures basically involves making sure I have them all printed out and handy when the game starts. Prepping for adventures that I'm writing for my ongoing games, the ones I'm actually writing, I have been known to be utterly unprepared and run an adventure, run a session. There are many situations where I've started a session knowing what the next adventure is based on where the characters are going, what their goals are, and have absolutely none of it prepared. Nothing prepared for it. And benefited from the fact that the characters had to travel to get to the place, and I simply arranged enough encounters to keep them busy. And then I have another week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, depending on the game group and so forth on schedule, to prepare for the actual adventure that they're going into. As an example of that, in my face-to-face game, the last session of last year, before the holidays came and completely nuked our schedule, player characters were traveling to they're traveling to a legendary, they're traveling to a dungeon that should be legendary, but nobody's ever heard of it, that is hidden on a mountain that has no name, in a borderland territory, but not on the main routes through the borderlands, so nobody really knows anything about it. It was hidden in the least exciting place it could possibly be hidden by the people who built it. And they know that they have to pass through a gateway dungeon to get into a hidden valley before they can get to the dungeon itself. I had encounters already designed. I actually ran this as a hex crawl, and I had encounters designed for each hex, and I had random encounters and so forth. The whole hex crawl, not the whole thing, but as much of it as I figured I would need was written down, so I was in good shape. In that last session, they got to the entrance to the dungeon, and I had drawn 0 maps. I had not drawn anything, goose egg. No maps whatsoever for this. I knew the general character of the dungeon that they were going into, and that is it. Battle mat was lying in front of us, blank. And out of the top of my head, I thought of the least friendly possible thing I could stick in a front room of a dungeon for this group of characters. And I drew the room, and they entered the room, and they found 2 doors inside, and they opened a door, and a secret door opened in the wall, and rust monsters rolled out. Not literally rolled, but came out. And then we had a nice rust monster battle, which no one enjoyed except the rust monsters until they died. And that finished the session off. And I was left then with weeks of the holiday season when I would have time irregularly, but I wouldn't be able to set up a game. With the first game being yesterday. And I got right on it. I seriously did. I got right on it. I drew the maps. 4 levels of dungeon. 1 level's a decoy. 4 levels of dungeon going from one side to the other through this mountain to get them to this hidden valley that they're traveling to. And as I say, I knew the character of the dungeon. And I drew all the maps, and I made a list of all the room numbers, and about 2/3 of the room I gave a title to describing what was in them. Of course, I took that first room from the battle mat and put it right there on my map, so it was all there. So then you think the next thing you start stocking rooms. The game was scheduled for yesterday afternoon. Yesterday morning, I stocked 33 rooms. And when I say stocked, I don't mean I scribbled down brief notes. I wrote full room details for 33 rooms. I have no idea how I did it. I usually can't think of material that quickly, but it helps that, and I'm not giving any spoilers away at this point, the players are well aware of the situation now. This is a dungeon of traps. Almost every room has at least one trap. Some rooms have layered traps. Traps upon traps. Most of the traps are at least somewhat deadly. Even the ones that aren't deadly are very inconvenient. I did things in this dungeon I've never done before, traps I've never used before, I've put in this dungeon, traps I've used before, possibly excessively, I put in the dungeon and upgraded to make them more interesting. And as I say, I did. There's 37 rooms in the dungeon. I got 33 of them done. 2 of them already involve the rust monsters. So that was a lot of rooms. I've got to finish up the last few rooms of the dungeon that they haven't reached before the next session in 3 weeks. So, how do I prep? The last session of my online game on Wednesday of last week, the player characters found a map that is going to lead them to their next location. They found it right at the end of the session. As of the end of the session, I had nothing created for where that map leads them to. Over the course of the next couple of days, I drew the maps and I began stocking the area. I have all the maps I actually need. I'd kind of like to do a wilderness map, but it's not critical. It's not a complicated wilderness, so I'm not super concerned about it. But I've got my interior maps all done. I have stocked a number of the most significant parts of the dungeon environment, but I have many more parts to stock. I've even done a few things, and I'm not going to talk about this too much because spoilers, that I've never done before. This adventure is completely different than the trap dungeon I've just described. With any luck, I'll have all the rooms detailed. It's possible I won't. If we start Wednesday's session and the rooms are not fully detailed, I will have what I have printed out. I will have sketched out notes for the rooms that aren't actually fully detailed. And when the players come to them, I will make it up as I go along. And as I'm making it up, I'll write it down. Longhand, right there on my page. And then, since I do think I'm probably going to publish this at some point, I will go ahead and type them up later and do a new revision. And once the players have done the entire environment, I'll probably release it on the forum. I'm probably going to release the other adventure on the forum, but it's a long way from complete. So, how do I prep? Sometimes I run games with copious pre-written details, and sometimes I run them by the skin of my teeth. So, there you go. And just to extend the answer a little longer, that's how I prep for a session. How do I prep for a campaign? I don't prep for a campaign. I don't prep for a campaign at all. My rule for starting a new group in a new campaign is to start with standard modular adventures, pre-written adventures for characters of whatever level I'm starting them at. Because I don't have clue one what these player characters are going to be like, how this group is going to gel together and how they're going to function. Once I've seen them play for anywhere from 2 or 3 to maybe a year's worth of sessions, then maybe I have an idea of where they're going. Then maybe I have an idea of what kind of an adventure will appeal to these players, to this character group, what will work for them and so forth. And then I may start thinking about prepping for the campaign that I've already been running for many sessions. No, I don't prep for campaigns. I don't plan for campaigns. Campaign worlds, well, my worlds have existed. The ones I'm using now have existed for years. I have much material, much of it contradictory. I make do. But as far as prepping for a campaign in advance, I don't do that. I've never done that. I never have done that. I've never done more than a year's worth of campaign prep in a game year. I should say game year's worth of campaign prep in advance. Because no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. And in this case, the enemy is the player characters. Anything I try to plan out, any story I try to write, they're gonna sideline it. They're gonna do something different. Almost always gonna do something different than what I expect. And that's good. That's how it's supposed to be. So I don't do a lot of story prep. And most of the other stuff I've had done for so long, I don't remember how I did it. Most of it happened ad hoc. Most of it actually happened on the fly. Player characters visited a new village I have no details for. I make up a bunch of names and write them down. I've got a document in Google Docs now. Used to have to keep it on my own computer, but now I've got it on Google Docs, where I fill in the names and roles and maybe a sketch or two about characters. I usually don't even have full details for the NPCs they encounter because they're rarely going to fight them. If they do, I can make it up on the fly if I need to. It's not a big deal. That's how I prep for campaigns. I don't. So this is probably a lot longer than I intended it to be. I answered less than half the questions on my sheet, and I did have a second page. So I'll have more to do. Next week will probably not be questions and answers. I'm not exactly sure. I'll either do the story item or there may be another video coming. I've got a couple of things in the fire that will come out when they come out. But for this week anyway, thanks for watching.